a big welcome because this is his first Rock Band talk for Kansas City.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Humanities Center for all the good work they do in gathering people around the university together and letting us share ideas. I'll go through this fairly quickly. Not that you sort of have to go slide by slide, but I often think that the benefit of a PowerPoint is it's triggered sort of associational thinking in your head, right? So sort of a lot of ideas coming through associational thinking. And if I go a little bit quickly, we'll leave some time for questions, and I actually think the sort of interdisciplinary time for question and feedback is one of the more interesting things. This talk came about not so much as an academic enterprise, but interestingly of people in the community asking to be educated, right? They want to learn things, they want to know things and what's happening. So rather than writing an article and then going to try to tell people about the article, this is sort of inverting the academic process a little bit, listening to the needs of people in the community, what are the things they care about and want to learn about, and then trying to design a presentation to educate members of the community, and that, you know, at some flow of its own will learn into articles and writings and other things of perhaps a more academic setting. But I've given this talk probably 4 times in the community. I'll show up at a church basement, and, you know, to show you the hunger of people for knowledge and understanding in Detroit, 100 people will show up, right? To hear a boring law professor, you know, speak in the basement of a church in Detroit, right? Because they care about these issues. And so I'll be sharing with you what I've been sharing with them, in part perhaps as a model to suggest to some of you who are also doing very interesting work that's relevant to the city, what are ways that you might also be thinking about sharing your knowledge and expertise with the citizens of the city at these pretty challenging but very interesting times that we're facing. So the talk is called Connecting the Dots, you know, Water Shutoffs, Emergency Management, Bankruptcy, and Beyond. There's my faceless friend who I've grown somewhat fond of. We all know the game, right? You sort of have all these random dots. They don't mean anything unless you connect them in the proper way. If you connect them in the proper way, you start to see the emergence of patterns that otherwise are latent, right? So the effort here is to try to say there's a whole bunch of things happening. We often view them in a very discrete and disassociated way. Do we have different understandings if we're trying to view them as a collective? And if so, how are we going to try to connect some of the dots between the issues that we're facing? So, what are some of the possible dots that we would seek to connect? We have emergency management. We have a scholar here that's studying emergency management from Brown, which is great, as a fellow at the Humanities Center. We've got Detroit Future City, which is the effort to be planning the next 50 years of the city of Detroit. We have the recent Blight Removal Task Force report, right, which is proposing tearing down absolutely every abandoned building in the city at the cost of nearly $2 billion in a 5-year period. Right? We'll ask if that's the first best use of $2 billion that Detroit could be using. Is an interesting question. The water shutoffs, one of the issues that nationally and internationally has garnered the most reaction, right, in terms of what's happening in Detroit and its implications for the city's reputation, but also the lives of our residents. You have the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, right, which is going to be the proposal that's being the subject of hearings down in front of Judge Rhodes, which is the outline in terms of a fiscal plan for the city of Detroit for the next couple of generations. And then you have the Detroit Public Schools, which in many respects was the precursor to emergency management. And if you want kind of a sort of morality tale about whether this works or doesn't work in the context of Detroit, might be a dot that we would look to try to get some guidance as to how structurally these things are fixed or are not fixed, given a proposal of a solution for emergency management. But those are all kind of orbiting planets, right? What I'm interested in trying to think through, if one were to engage in a root cause type of analysis, to try to say what are some of the unifying themes behind this, that's where you're getting the kind of center dot, at least within this configuration. And I'll explain this a little bit in a minute. In my own mind, the best way that I put these things together is in imagining each one of these dots or independent phenomena as a separate manifestation of a convergence between the effects of structural racism, right, and the effects of fiscal austerity. So we think what is happening in Detroit ultimately can be broken down to that convergence between structural racism and fiscal austerity. Well, once you start to delve into those two forces, you see different timelines arise, right? So thinking about structural racism in Detroit, in 80 years may be generous, right? We maybe go back 100, 120 years to actually think about the full implications of structural racism. But certainly you cannot think about the geography of the city, the economics of the city, the politics of the city, without a very thorough and thoughtful understanding of the role of race, racism, racial tension, and how that is mapped out as a matter of geography, as a matter of policy. Right? More recently, and this is not just Detroit, and neither is structural racism, but I think it's sort of interesting, why is it worse here, right? Why are the manifestations here often 1 or 2 standard deviations more extreme than the manifestations elsewhere? You can't think about contemporary issues, particularly emergency management and the bankruptcy, without thinking about fiscal austerity. Right? We're going to have to again unpack what these words are, but if you want a timeline, again these are a little bit oversimplified, think about the Reagan-Thatcher era. Right? Think about the policies, particularly as they affect cities, since the Reagan-Thatcher era. And I had the privilege of spending about 2 days with Jeffrey Sachs earlier this month going around Detroit thinking about sustainability in the city. And as he said, you know, every president since Reagan has been a Reaganite, right? At least in terms of the basic outlines and the infrastructure as it affects fiscal austerity, as it affects cities like Detroit. All right, so why are we in worse shape, right? The way I view it, and try to explain it to my students and others, I view cities and politics as polities as living organisms, right? And then I view racism as a pathology, right? So racism is a pathology that infects the organism of a city, right? And what do we know? All organisms get stressed, right? Healthy organisms can adapt to stressful situations better than unhealthy organisms. Right? So the sort of thinking is, if you think about the pathology of structural racism, which my hypothesis or claim would be has affected Detroit far more seriously than it's affected other cities, right? And that's an answer I can't, or a question I can't quite answer why we've been worse. But I think historically, you sort of look at the manifestations of racism and you find it particularly virulent in Southeast Michigan. Has been a pathology that has prevented the city and the region, because I don't think about Detroit without thinking about the region, to adapt to the stresses of fiscal austerity over time, right? And so if you have that sort of dysfunctional organism, you have the added stress of fiscal austerity, you have the dysfunctionality of the region, you have serious maladaptation over time that has given us the series of issues that we're facing today. Right? And to me, that's one of the more common narratives. Well, what's a structure in which we can try to understand both fiscal austerity and structural racism? The way I present it with my students is a dialectic that is ongoing between belief systems and institutions. Right? And beliefs affect institutions, institutions affect beliefs. If you're trying to get structural change over time, you're going to have to affect both one of these. Like, for example, if I only change the institutional matrix, right? So imagine Brown v. Board of Education 60 years ago, change it in the law, didn't change the belief system, and I would really say 60 years later we haven't made substantial progress in terms of integration and establishing equality and quality in public education in our country because we didn't get at the root belief systems, right? So belief systems can be very general. It could be a religious system, right? It could be an economic theory. I think neoclassical economics is a belief system and functions as a belief system or a worldview. Could be in these, again, language gets to be a barrier, and I'll try to unpack a little bit of this. You think about neoliberalism, right, as a belief system. You think about fiscal austerity, which is related as a belief system. You think about white privilege as a belief system, right? And we've got to think about how it functions as a belief system. How do beliefs get formed? How do they get transferred over time? How do individuals get inculcated into belief systems? How do you get new forms of belief systems are all part of this question if you're going to get economic and social change. Then you have to worry about the institutional matrix, right? And the institutional matrix, you think about that's the laws, the rules, the norms, the regulations is sort of one way to package that. Another way, this is coming from Douglas North, an economic historian, he talks about the rules of the game and the players of the game, right? And the interchange and the adaptivity between the rules of the game and the players of the game gives you a different sense of how you're getting change inside the institutional matrix, but then you have all this interesting reciprocal feedback between beliefs and institutions, right? So that's at least the sort of broad framework that I try to adapt as I'm thinking about beliefs and institutions and then mapping that back onto the city of Detroit. So we'll sort of play through that, and again, sort of remember the underlying diagnosis about structural racism and about fiscal austerity. Belief system or worldviews have important functions, right? The function is to provide order and to provide meaning, right? And a belief system that works well provides order and provides meaning, right? When it stops preserving those functions, it starts to break down, right? Examples, as I've already said, about neoclassical economics. I can think about American exceptionalism. I can think about the Protestant work ethic. I can think about white privilege. All of those things start to function as inherent belief systems. And then I have to worry about the power, right, an institutional matrix. How am I going to allocate scarce resources over time? How do I distribute social benefits and burdens? And again, that interesting interplay between rules of game and the players of the game. All right, so now think about the Reagan-Thatcher era, right? Think about fiscal austerity. Think about the Tea Party, right? Think about Republican politics. We see this every day as different manifestations of what I'm calling here today notions of fiscal austerity, right? That then gets associated with a multi-layered set of belief systems that are supporting notions of fiscal austerity, right? And so what are some of the components that we might be able to list out? Incredibly strong belief in markets, right? Markets work, markets are efficient, trust markets, right? Markets will solve the problem. An incredibly strong fear of the state, right? Remember Ronald Reagan, the worst thing you can hear is somebody knock on your door and say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, right? Government is bad, government corrupt, government ineffective, right? And think about how that get projected on the national understanding and awareness of Detroit, right? The problem in Detroit, right, is that we don't have markets, we should free up markets, and that we have corrupt mayors, right? We blame this all not on 80 years of structural racism and fiscal austerity, but on Kwame Kilpatrick, right, who, from my history understanding, has not been the mayor for the past 80 years. But, you know, what do I know? All right, so strong belief in property markets, or property, strong belief in property rights. So we have this other underlying narrative that's going forward. Hypersensitive individualism, right, is all focused on the individual. Marginalizes the role of structure and social context, right? It's not context or systems that matters, it's the individual that matters and choice that matters. I have all this inbred system about blame and punishment, right? If you fail to perform, right, that's because you fail as an individual. It's not because you're living in an opportunity structure that doesn't permit you to actually to thrive and to survive, right? If the federal government were to help Detroit, it would be called what, right? Obama proposes a blank for Detroit. Right? What's the word we're going to fill in there? Bailout. Right? Just as we had to bail out, you know, GM, we had to bail out Chrysler, we're going to bail out Detroit. Is bailout a positive or negative emotion associated with it? Negative, right? So we've already given it language, right? A label, a bailout. We've already associated that language with an emotion, negative, right? And so we're starting to see the depth of this. This is a very hard thing to try to unpack if this really is the diagnosis of the nature of the problem that we're facing, right? And that's off the table. You can't even propose a bailout, even if you're going to use the negative language that they've already prepackaged for us to be thinking about that. Right? So we blame individuals, we punish individuals who fail to live up to our standards. We have this false belief in meritocracy. Right? Anybody who succeeds, succeeds because they are meritorious. Right? Anybody who fails, fails because they're not meritorious. We layer it over now, not with white supremacy, right, but with color blindness. Right? But try to tell me when you read Supreme Court opinions, what's the difference in terms of the functional implications of the court ruling and the doctrines. And then we have this sort of notion of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Right? If you don't have bootstraps, well, bootstrap your bootstraps. Right? And we have this kind of sort of funny notion of this endless system of bootstrapping with it never grounded in any kind of structure or reality. Right? Serious set of issues to try to consider, to try to challenge, to try to change, but that is the belief system underlying fiscal austerity. That then, as we've already anticipated, is associated with a particular set of institutional structures, minimalist state, right? Unrestrained private markets, privatization of public assets, minimal public works and benefits, minimal social safety net, right? What have I just implicitly defined, and we'll see this later? The city's plan of adjustment. Right? The answer to our fiscal problem is already prepackaged within the institutional matrix of fiscal austerity. Right? And now what Judge Rhodes is being asked to do is simply lay his hands on it as a matter of federal bankruptcy law and create separate and unequal societies based upon minimalist states that are going to be the model for majority-minority municipalities. All right. Not going to go too deep into this, but there's an international component. Right? Again, timed at the same time frame, the Reagan-Thatcher era. We're thinking not about domestic politics, but about the World Bank and the IMF. You sort of think about the Washington Consensus, was started in the Reagan era. Same thing, fiscal austerity internationally, fiscal austerity domestically. Privatize and deregulate domestically, privatize, deregulate internationally. Shrink government, right? Shrink government. Cut spending and taxes, cut spending and taxes. Plans of adjustment for Detroit, structural adjustment programs in terms of the international neoliberalism. And this is where the language comes in differently. right? And this is again where you sort of confusion where people are going to hear words. Internationally, this would all be known as neoliberalism, right? And, oh, it's neoliberal, and here we say, well, that doesn't make any sense because here we think about it as conservatism, right? It's the Republican Party, it's the Tea Party, but they're the same thing. One interesting divergence, however, is what's happened internationally. Right? This caused riots in the street. This causes the global backlash in the 1990s. This you can't speak of internationally with any respect. Right? You will be sneered at. You will be laughed at least in terms of discourse. You can talk differently about terms of policy and whether policy has changed, but at least in terms of discourse, this is discredited. Right? And again, if you're dealing with somebody like Jeffrey Sachs, who has international sort of experience and background, and you make the comparison between structural adjustment and the plan of adjustment, they see it automatically. Right? And then they have the same reaction. That fails. That has been proven not to work. That will not build a society. That will not help people. That does not make for a better, more productive, healthier economy or social environment. Right? And yet, look at the evolutionary paths. Right? A rejection internationally, and yet this now becomes the logical, necessary, unquestionable, uncriticized answer for what is ailing Detroit. Right? And how you reconcile those is an interesting question that I don't pretend to have all the answers to. So that's fiscal austerity, right? That's the 40 years. We're now moving to getting some little bit more traction on this notion of structuralized racialization. And a lot of my thinking on this and what you're going to hear really is just sort of not so well packaged John Powell. Right? So if you want to sort of get better thinking, go look at John Powell's book, Racing to Justice. But this is sort of my interpretation of what a lot of what John talks about. And first off, structural racialization is a verb. It's not a noun, right? It's something we do to people. It's not something that exists in the abstract, which is important. But what John teaches is that we only look at the tip of the iceberg, right? When we think about race and racism, we think only about intentional discrimination, right? Certainly the law does, and I think most public opinion would follow that. That's just part of it, right? The lower quadrant is that structural racism. Right? Which is really the manifestation that is affecting Detroit in a most significant way. Right? In structural racism, to think about it a shorthand way, what are the structures and networks that create opportunity for some and deny opportunities for others? Right? Right? Then you have implicit bias. Right? And you look at the new cognitive psychology and the sort of brain science that is taking place, and you find how wonderfully complicated we all are, right? And how a lot of these function unconsciously, implicitly, right? And that how we create categories in our own mind, and that's one of the struggles, right? How we sort of categorize things and make generalizations based upon categories. We have all sorts of media messages coming in and social messages coming in with this belief system. And we ultimately have belief systems that are external that we internalize. Right? And it gets very complicated, but if I believe in implicit bias, I can't believe in intent as a standard for law. Right? You start to see if you really have a richer, deeper understanding of structural racism, you also have an incredibly powerful way to critique the existing understanding of what American constitutional law is. Right? And why the logic here, right? Because all systems are based on some sort of hydraulics or logic. This exists to create a hierarchical structure to perpetuate notions of white privilege. Right? And that is done historically in history. This is an example where past is prologue. Right? It continues to operate in a system that is creating notions of white privilege. Right? And if you don't understand this dynamic, it's very hard to understand what's really happening in Southeast Michigan. Right? Because this is now really the template in which these kind of theories for 80, 100 years have been mapping out. Most of you people know the history of Detroit incredibly well, better than I do, but you can sort of see that well embedded in Sugrew's story, well embedded in June Manning Thomas's wonderful work about planning in Detroit. And my own sort of quick summary is you can't think about any issue in Detroit without addressing the 3 R's. Right? And it's not reading, writing, and arithmetic, which I never understood why those were 3 R's anyway. The 3 R's in Detroit, if you're trying to understand what's happening, is race, regionalism, and reconciliation. Right? And if any policy or program is not addressing explicitly race, regionalism, and reconciliation, it is an inauthentic program in terms of defining the issues or trying to establish a policy agenda that will be anywhere near hitting the mark in terms of trying to do real progress. All right. This is not theoretical. Right? This impacts everybody's life every day. Right? And you can see it probably clearer in Southeast Michigan than almost any place else in the country. Right? So we have a notion, right? We can understand what opportunity is, right? We can create a metric that measures opportunity, right? We have mappers here already. I see Andrew across the table. And then we can spatially represent opportunity. Right? An opportunity means you have a nice house, or a quality house, or a decent house. You have employment. You have decent schools. You have decent health care. You have public transportation or private transportation. You have basic food security. You have a decent living environment. Right? So in your own minds, right, you're all familiar with the city. You're familiar with the region. Imagine those metrics. Right? Associate those metrics with a color. Right? And on the map, darker areas represent higher opportunities, right? Lighter areas represent less opportunity, right? And in your own mind, create your own map of Southeast Michigan, right? Where's high areas of opportunity, where's low areas of opportunity, right? And thankfully, the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University in Columbus has created a mapping on behalf of the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, and this is the mapping, right, that you get of Southeast Michigan. Right? And again, it's a little bit hard to see. This is the SEMCOG 7-county areas. But imagine if you were on the space station and looking down at an opportunity map. What you see in the light areas is what? If I'm looking up in the upper left side, right? Pontiac. Right? You see the geopolitical boundaries of Pontiac represented by the absence of opportunity. Right? Move down over here. Right? You see the geopolitical boundaries basically of Detroit. Right? Represented by the absence of opportunity, right? And what is surrounding us? We're not in a whole area of an opportunity desert, right? We're an opportunity desert or island, right? Deprived opportunity, surrounded really by rich areas of opportunity, right? So what happens now if I define the problem only as the city of Detroit and I ask, are there sufficient resources? You say, well, hell no, there's no resources. That's the problem, right? That's why I have a financial emergency. What if I look at the SEMCOG area of the 7 counties and say, are there sufficient resources to meet the people's needs, right? Much easier question to answer, right? And what we'll see in each one of these artifacts or these dots is they look at Detroit in isolation, right? They defy the R of regionalism, right? They focus only on Detroit, Detroit in isolation. It then creates a logic of social triage. Right? Then I need to make tough choices. Then I need to make trade-offs. Right? Then I need to have people sacrifice. Right? But that puts us in Donner Pass when we need not be in Donner Pass. Right? And that's the framing. And one thing we teach our law students is what? If I control the frame, I control the outcome. If I concede the frame of Detroit Future City, or the Blight Task Force report, or the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, I've lost already. Right? Let's pack our bags, and like the other 300,000 people in the last 15 years, let's leave Detroit. Right? That's not an acceptable answer. If I then overlay opportunity and race, right? Because in this country we racialize poverty, not surprising. The green dots represent the presence of the African American community, right? And what do we see? Right? Almost a one-to-one correspondence between the presence of African American communities in large number and the absence of opportunity. Right? Structural racism, right? Mapped out, defining the geography of Southeast Michigan. Now go back to that notion of belief systems and institutions, right? You have a notion of social reproduction. Belief systems reproduce themselves over time. Institutions reproduce themselves over time. Not in identical forms, right, but often in identical functions, right? So I think most of us can pretty easily think about the transition between slavery as a belief system and as an institutional matrix morphing into Jim Crow, right? Same beliefs, right? Not hard to see. Different institutional structure, but for the same function of preserving white privilege, right? What you now need to see, and if you don't see it, you're not seeing the issues in Detroit, is what John Powell calls spatial racism, right? Spatial racism is that segregation of wealth and opportunity, right? And race, right? And do you want to know where ground zero spatial racism is today? We're living in it, Southeast Michigan. And if you don't see how ways in that is identical, right? If not in form, but in function to Jim Crow, and if you don't trace that lineage back to slavery, you're not seeing the interconnection between the belief system and the institutions. You're not even defining or understanding the challenges ahead of you, and you cannot have decent policy proposals. Right? That's at least the logic of what the structure suggests. All right, that's your background, right? So we're now going to transition out of the kind of analytics into thinking about, well, what are we doing about these dots? Right? What are we doing about these artifacts that we find, these different policies or these challenges? Well, how has the state responded to this? And again, I apologize because people in the back don't see it. But this is the diagram between 2002 and 2011 of state revenue sharing. Right? So in the face of increasing need, how will we respond? And this is not just Republicans, as I said, that we're all Reaganites now. This is Granholm, right? This is Schneider. This is the decline in state revenue sharing, right? How do you survive in this opportunity desert, right, when all of the resources are being removed, right, not being provided? So let's think about connecting the dots, right? Each dot is its own artifact. Right? So think about emergency management, the Detroit Public Schools, Detroit Future City, Blight Task Force Report, the Detroit Water Sewer Department and the water shutoffs, the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, but each one embodies, like an artifact, right, the belief system, the worldview, the institutional matrix, right? And we now want to see embedded in those artifacts the theoretical constructs that we've been talking about, right? That's at least sort of the challenge that's ahead of us, and each one is a microcosm. Right? And each one can then represent this larger sort of structure. You know, we live in a world with all sorts of invisible forces, right? So the challenge is, how do we make visible that which is normally invisible, right? Well, we all did it as kids, right? You get out a piece of paper, right? You put all the iron filings around the piece of paper, and then you put a magnet in the center, right? And you have a method in order to make visible the invisible magnetic rings, right? The challenge intellectually for us is the same. How do we see the force field created by structural racism? How do we see the force field created by fiscal austerity? How do we see how that intersects and actually changes facts on the ground, right? Creates that geography, like a glacier does, coming through and shifts things around, right? We've got to have that kind of orientation, that kind of sensitivity, if we're going to understand what's going on. So we'll sort of quickly go through the different dots, right? Think about the fiscal crisis. Right? Well, the fiscal crisis, in many respects, can be manipulated by the frame. It's not a debt problem, right? It's a cash flow problem. So if I create a crisis in cash flow, I have a financial emergency. I have to declare bankruptcy, right? I could have think about the relative proportion of debt in Detroit to income versus the United States to income, right? Why isn't the United States bankrupt, right? Because it's got cash flow, right? Not because it has no debt. So what actually happened to create a cash flow crisis in Detroit, triggering emergency management, triggering the bankruptcy? We already saw the falling state revenue share. 3 primary sources of revenue I'm listing out. Falling state revenue sharing, right? If state revenue sharing was the same as a decade ago, no cash flow crisis, no bankruptcy, right? Then you have falling property tax revenue. But think about the decimated private real estate market, right? Both as a matter of tax foreclosure, which is grounded in poverty, right, which is a basis of this opportunity desert. The private tax foreclosure, or private mortgage foreclosure crisis, which was driven largely by predatory practices, right? Reverse redlining coming through, another manifestation of racism. Property taxes falling dramatically. Revenue sharing falling dramatically. And you have increasing legacy costs, right? But what was the problem? Problem of political corruption, right? We don't see the structure. Right? And we don't see how the structure can be manipulated along a standard which is going to create a financial emergency that then dictates the sets of policies that give us an emergency manager. You can go much deeper into sort of the financialization of the municipal crises, right? You've got the COPs and the swaps, you've got all of the bond trading, you've got the huge amount of the cash flow that has to go towards payment of debt, right? But you want to actually see a graph of the bond market, right, which used to be the boring, safe area. The bond market kicks into gear when the fiscal austerity starts in the 1980s, right? Because you don't have the money that you used to have. You have to get your money elsewhere. You create this new market that has these other sort of cascading and unintended consequences, right? Then you have the answer, right? I create the crisis. I then have the answer. So the answer then is an emergency manager, right? State-imposed, anti-democratic, right? That's not demagoguery, right? That's facts, right? EM template maps onto the neoliberal fiscal austerity agenda, as we already saw before. So I have the crisis, I have the answer, right? Shrink the size of government, privatize public assets, cancel labor contracts, reduce the workforce, take the city into bankruptcy, right? Doesn't come out of just nowhere, right? Happens in terms of lockstep into the broader set of worldviews and institutional matrix. We've already said that the Detroit Public School actually is a precursor for so much of this, right? The structural problem is state financing, right? Where I have first a segregation of the variable costs and the fixed costs, right? So fixed costs are still done locally at the tax base. Variable costs are taken with the state allowance, right? I then introduce charter schools and interdistrict schools of choice, which basically siphon off all the students, but the students take their allowance with them, right? Which creates what? A cash flow crisis, right? The challenge for the schools, and it's the same challenge the emergency managers have faced and have failed, is you have to be able to cut your costs faster than your revenues fall, right? Think about what that means. I have to cut my costs faster than my revenues fall, right? Almost impossible when I'm in a regime with high fixed costs. Can't be done, right? What that leads to is structural deficits, right? Which leads to what more? More emergency management, right? I actually feel sorry for the emergency managers. They're no more capable of dealing with this problem, which is structural, than a democratically elected school board, right? And yet, this was knowable, right? And it becomes particularly transparent when you have falling demography. You can sort of mask this over if you have increasing enrollments and increasing demographic growth, right? But rather than fix the problem, right, policymakers, in my mind, intentionally stood on the sidelines because they wanted to kill the Detroit public school system, right? And I don't think that's a very controversial statement, right? Unless they're completely stupid. I don't believe people are stupid. Right? As a result, though, we're letting that agenda displace our children. We're not focusing on the children, not worried about a high quality of education, and go back to that story again, 60 years post-Brown v. Board of Education. All right, next stop, right? We're going on a rapid journey here, a lot of sort of train stops to be getting before we get to our questions and conversation. Detroit Future City, right? This is our best thinking about how we're going to deal with Detroit's problems for the next 50 years. What it uses, we're saying, what's the moving pieces? What's the hydraulics? The distressed housing market becomes the template, right, of all future land use changes, right? That then becomes a template of who gets investment in city services, who doesn't, right? And then ultimately, the areas that are distressed housing markets are going to be assigned to non-residential purposes. Right? I'm going to give you sort of three maps, and it's hard to see all the colors, but I'll sort of see where the colors stay the same, where the pattern stays the same, even though the colors are going to be changing. I'll sort of quickly walk through Detroit Future City in just three maps. This is housing occupancy, right? The kind of bluish colors, right, against the boundaries, those are high occupancy areas, right? Those are viable neighborhoods. That is where we're going to invest in city services. That's in the future where we're going to have traditional single-family residence preserved. The orangish areas, reddish areas, are what they call the moderate density areas, right? Those are ultimately be called green residential. We're going to have no increase in residential purposes, but if you want to stay and be surrounded by prairie grass, welcome to it. We're not going to kick you out. And then you have the kind of purplish areas, which are the low occupancy areas, right? Those are going to be intended for no future residential use, right? Creates a little problem, though. People live there now. Right? How do you move from people living there to people not living there? You can start to see a sub-agenda in some of the other policies that are taking place, which in my mind are just implicit ways in order to get people out of the neighborhoods you don't want them living in. Right? But also think about what this does. A housing market, right? That's a proxy for what? Wealth and poverty. Right? So this is actually a map on where relative wealth is in Detroit and where relative poverty is. Right? And the poverty is in these purplish areas, where people are not supposed to be, and we're not going to have any future residential housing. Right? And again, what's missing here? Right? And this map is not atypical. This is about 98% of the maps in Detroit Future City, which is a 360-page book. Right? Where's Oakland County? Where's Macomb County? Where's Grosse Pointe? Where's Dearborn? Where's Downriver? They're nowhere. They're not represented at all. Right? Detroit is presented as an island. Right? Separate, right? And now go back to that wealth map, right? We're putting ourselves as separate, right? We're violating the R of regionalism. There's almost no meaningful, an underlying meaningful discussion of race in this report, right? So we're violating the second R, and if you're not talking about race and regionalism, very hard to get to the third R of reconciliation, right? So it creates this ahistorical story of Detroit, denying the structural racism, but it feeds into the fiscal austerity and says, oh my God, we have falling revenues, we have no cavalry, we've got to engage in social triage. If you concede that much, everything else makes sense, right? If you concede that much, everything else is lost, right? Is the sort of argument that I would make in terms of framing. So quickly then, we do reverse Robin Hood, right? This is where city services will be invested in. So we'll invest in the wealthier neighborhoods, right? We will disinvest. These pink areas are going to be decommissioned, ultimately. No city services, right? And we're going to use city service investment as one of the hydraulic levers in which we're moving people out of some neighborhoods, preserving other neighborhoods. And then we get to our 50-year vision, and again you see the patterns of the colors remain the same, even though the colors change. The yellow is traditional single-family residential, the places that we preserve, the wealthier neighborhoods. The green is that green residential. It must sound better if it's green, right? Green has a positive connotation. Or you could be homesteading out there in the middle of the prairie grass, right? But you can still live there with reduced city services. And then you have this sort of bluish turquoise and darker green colors. That becomes euphemistically blue and green infrastructure, right? And that realistically is anything the state wants to approve, right? Whether it's a hog farm or whether it's, any potential use is going to go into that vacant land, right? And one of the greatest ironies of blue infrastructure, retention ponds, right? So in the very neighborhoods where now water is being shut off, ironically 50 years from now we're going to flood it with water, right? Welcome to Detroit Future City. Right, next dot, right, the Blight Task Force report. I gave an hour talk on this last night at Marygrove, right? It's just, I will say, there's intellectual integrity in Detroit Future City. A lot of smart people, a lot of good thinking. I argue with the frame, right, but not necessarily with the sophistication of the people doing it. There is no intellectual integrity in the Blight Removal Task Force report. Is it a report where the charge was to determine what is the quickest way to tear down housing, right? It specifically eschews any root cause analysis. We said, we know all this stuff is relevant, but that's not our charge. That's clearly outside of our mandate, right? So now we're going to tell how to get rid of this problem, and it's housing, right? This is not like, something that is not related to white flight or to structural racism or to the entire history here. This is housing, and there's absolutely no historical analysis. The word race does not appear in the document once, right? So no race, no racism, no discrimination, no segregation, no white flight, right? And yet this is supposed to be a story of what we're going to do for our city, right? We're going to spend $2 billion if I include both the industrial and the residential. I'm going to get rid of every house that is abandoned. Half of those are quote-unquote blighted under a very aggressive definition of blight. The other half are not blighted, but they have indicators of blight, which means they're empty, right? I'm going to divert the hardest hit housing funds, $52 million, that was intended to keep people in their homes, right? But what's the problem? They're living in neighborhoods we don't necessarily want people in, right? So I actually consciously withdraw the support that would have been able to keep people in their homes in the hardest hit funds, divert that to be knocking those houses out. So get out of your house quickly, right? Knock the house down, right? Where are the people? This is a completely property-oriented, ahistorical document, right? With no economic case, right? You say, this is Dan Gilbert, you're a billionaire, you know business, right? No economic case in there. No effort to even create an economic case. Has this magical thinking about markets will simply come in, right? And what I told people last night, and I tell my students, we are living in one of the biggest market failures in global history, right? Detroit is a market failure, right? So anybody who tells you the market's going to come and solve your problem, right, is selling you a bill of goods until you can give you a hard case. Give me a hard case, I'll take it. This is Missouri now. Show me. Don't just come and tell me magical thinking that markets are going to come in and revitalize this economy, right? And out of that $1 billion, I get 430 jobs, right? Because you want to know the fastest way to knock down every building in the city? Bring in the biggest bulldozer you can, right, from the biggest contractor you can find. We're going to find them in the suburbs. So actually, this money isn't even going to stay in the city, right? It's going to be coming out, and it's going to flow out to those other areas of high opportunity. This is our best and our brightest, right? This is one of the other 3 dots. Detroit Future City, Blight Task Force, Plan of Adjustment are the 3 documents will define the geography of Detroit for generations. Right? And we also have no critical thinking. Nobody standing up and saying that this stuff makes no sense, right? And we're in a major university, right? I think there's some silent voices that could be brought to the cause. Water shutoffs, right? The most significant thing to the water shutoffs to me was it provided a mirror for the belief system, right? This is all complicated stuff. This is hard for people to understand, right? Water was simple, people understand it, and it shows the belief system and the values, right? And it shows that blame, right? Oh, you'd much rather have your Comcast than your water bill, right? It doesn't address the fact that we are living in a city, sadly, that has 40% of the people below the poverty line, right? doesn't address the fact that that we'd have this whole sweep of tax foreclosures. And ironically, the Blight Task Force report goes through that entire narrative, tax foreclosure. Want to know one other word you don't find in that report? Poverty. Right? But what this does is make transparent, I think, the unjustifiable value structure within the regime of fiscal austerity. Right, has created a national and international outcry that, if pivoted from, could lead to a broader and more thoughtful methodology critique of what's happening in Detroit. But it is also consistent, right? Don't forget about the depopulation strategy, right? It's also consistent with this notion that there are people living in houses, in neighborhoods in Detroit, that the governing authorities don't want them in the long term, right? And that's another part of the water shutoff story. So then the plan of adjustment. Right. The mechanism now is to enshrine what is called by Michelle Anderson out of Stanford Law School now is a minimalist state. Right? We have all these cities, about 30 of them now going through some form of municipal distress, creates a new a minimalist state. It's a vehicle for the privatization and the sale of public assets. Right? So the Detroit Water and Sewage Department is now going to be regionalized. Bell Island is off to a lease with the state. Right? And ironically, do we have $1 billion to knock down houses? No, we don't have $1 billion to do anything in Detroit. But what is the biggest new loan that's going to be taken out as soon as we retire all the debt? Called euphemistically exit financing. Nearly $440 million targeted for the Blight Removal Task Force report. Right? We are now using the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, amongst other things, to be financing the demolition of buildings in Detroit. Complete absence of people, complete absence of investment and opportunity within this context of the plan of adjustment, and the judge must determine that this is feasible. Right? The benefit of a Chapter 9 proceeding is, at least in theory, there is supposed to be a living, viable city post-bankruptcy. Right? And yet, and I can give you a copy of it, I wrote a 25 single-spaced letter to Judge Rhodes critiquing his economic expert, who got $1 million for this report, on a report that is also just intellectually bankrupt. There isn't good thought going into this, but there's an echo chamber that is saying, well, it's in the Detroit Future City, it's in the Blight Task Report, it must be good for the city, right? And it's shocking the absence of sort of critical voices are at hand. So what can we do, right? I'm actually going to go through this, actually made very, very quickly, but just sort of say there are alternatives, right? The baseline, if I'm being consistent with my methodology, we have to start building a new belief system. We have to have a new value structure that's going to be making these sets of decisions, one focusing much more on equitable, people-focused development. That then has to be translated into the institutional matrix. How do we actually make policy with that? What are the rules? What are the regulations? What are the policies that will be appended to that? I think sustainability, and this is what Jeff Sachs was here a few weeks ago trying to say, could we create sustainable development goals for Detroit? Think about sustainable communities, sustainable economy, sustainable environment as a new methodology to try to be thinking about ordering ourselves both in the city but also in the region. One possibility. The water affordability plan that's been around for a decade, right, is an interesting way to say, how do you deal with an impoverished city? Much better, it's like price discrimination. It's not, not brilliant thinking. If you have a little bit of money, pay a little bit of money. If a little bit more, pay a little bit more. It's a whole lot easier to get a little bit when somebody has a little bit than to ratchet up a uniform price, right? So you actually, ironically, if you would have done this 10 years ago, would have gotten more revenue and actually more justice. Right? So there are other paradigms about rate structures, how they're structured, how we implement them that can be more equitable based upon ability to pay. Right? What's another banned word in a fiscal austerity state? Progressivity. Right? When I grew up, progressive taxes were a good thing. Right? People who were privileged and had a little bit more had the opportunity to give back a little bit more. We got to recapture that. There's a city ordinance in front of the city council for community benefits agreements. Right? New paradigm of development. Focuses on community participation, local focus of the development, new partnerships with business, places people at the center of development. Right? You don't have to be sort of a genius to think of these things. They're existing all around us if we're willing to look for them. Community land trust, right? New community-oriented ways of owning land, justice paradigm for land ownership, privileges notions of stewardship, gives tools for the community, creates an ethic of community as being one of the things that's going to revitalize us in terms of moving forward. Right? The idea of connecting the dots is trying to get a common core belief. A diagnosis is letting us see the commonalities of things as opposed to them all being separate. is an appreciation that many of these different things are manifestations of the same belief system, the same institutional matrix. Provides a framework that then people see more common interests, right? So if you're fighting water and I'm fighting blight in terms of the policies that the city heads us, maybe we have more in common than we thought as being different. And it's a reminder that other sets of possibilities are there in our future, right? In sort of a short term. So the last thing I will conclude this with, and I'd love to get questions. I'm sorry I've talked so long. If I didn't talk faster, it would have even been longer. So be thankful for that at least. Is the Kerner Commission report. And again, different belief system, different institutional matrix, different time, right? And it feels old now, right? But these are exact quotes. This is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving towards two societies, and everybody knows this. You almost say it in your sleep. One black, one white, separate and unequal. That was viewed as unacceptable then, right? That was a call to action. Here, that's a definition of the ratification of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, right? The Kerner Commission, choice is still possible. We can take action, right? But this alternative will require a commitment to a national action, compassionate, massive, and sustained, backed by the resources of the most powerful and the richest nation on earth. Hard choices. We have to raise taxes if we need to raise taxes. We have to dedicate the revenues, right? You could not say this as a politician today, right? Shows you how far we've come. Right? Shows you the road that we're going to have to crawl back from, right? But if we don't understand the nature of the challenge, if we don't understand the forces in front of us, very hard for us to try to imagine a better or different future. So happy to take questions.
Questions?
Throw them out.
Did you receive any response from Judge Rose when you mailed him the 25,
No.
sent him the 25 page?
And I send that to every media contact I've had for the last 3 years, which is a growing and a pretty impressive list. Nobody is interested in telling that story, right? And that's troubling. As I said, there's this echo chamber, right? And ironic, I would not have sort of been presumptuous to write the letter. I was one of the short list of people the judge interviewed to be the economic expert. Right? So I had the perfect platform to say, you didn't set me, that's fine. I don't get $1 million, you get my insights for free, right? But here's what you bought, right? And more importantly, what I told them in the application, as you would predict from this, is exactly what we got in the report. Ahistorical, no focus on race, no understanding of these broader dynamics. And so my critique of the economic expert report was really just a reflection of the thoughts here, as one would then project them on that, and basically saying this is why you need to have more than just an accountant's view of looking at this problem. It's not just balancing an accounting sheet, right? It's about thinking of this broader social context.
Yeah, Peter, thank you very much. I suppose, you know, what someone could say in response is, you moved out from Detroit to the region, okay? And someone would say, actually, there's a whole country out there.
Yeah.
Let's move out from the region to the country. And one of the difficulties for Detroit now is, it's an extreme case, but there are a lot of similar cases across the country where they're coming soon, okay? And all of this is taking place, not in 1968, but in 2014, and the new reality in 2014 is you have a shrinking and very scared middle class, okay? And that's ultimately where that money was going to come from to help impoverished areas. My read of the political environment post-Reagan and up till now is most of those people are scared for themselves. So how do you situate your recommendations in that sort of larger, broad reality?
Yeah. Again, great questions. And one of the things that's helpful, when you're focused on Detroit, you're sort of fighting fires, right? And they kind of bring your head up and you say, my God, the country still has all these problems. We've got the environment, right? We're talking about climate change, having to do with income inequalities. But that's the world in which we live, right? So I take your point. One of the reasons I actually focus locally is to sort of show the injustice, right? As well as the common history here, right? And the reason that's SEMCOG is that's one metropolitan area which is defined by one notion of inclusiveness, right? So that's a very defensible notion of what community is or could be as a building block that illustrates the internal injustice. So I actually think there is power in staying with the local/regional frame in making this argument, because it really does say we're one community, right? King and others might say beloved community, which starts to say a different belief system and value structure would then have different institutional matrix choices. So I actually think there is some power of trying to leverage the injustice in the community of the region as one of the resources to actually get action, right? Not that I'm naive about the reconciliation component of trying to get to that point. I think more broadly what you're seeing is the implications more substantially of the 40 years of fiscal austerity, right? And one of the notions is if you do that mapping of municipal distress, we're the canary in the mine. We're 1 or 2 standard deviations worse, but we're not alone, right? And so some of the work we've done with Beyond Bankruptcy and the other stuff at the center is to try to create a better national dialogue among some of the people who are similarly affected and say, what strategies do you have, right? At the end of the day, can we change this is a hard question. I mean, I'm not naive about the challenges. So if I'm thinking ultimately, and what you're saying, and what are the sort of national trends? Demographic changes, right? Which is really a strong point to better understand as a nation structural racism, get reactions to structural racism, because demographic change is either the best formula you have for an open, inclusive vision of what this country is about, right? Or it's a time bomb. Right? And it's our choice of how we're going to deal with that, and a lot of that comes back to how we collectively deal with issues of structural racism and who's our community and what's white privilege. Right? Second thing we have is these growing income and wealth inequalities. Right? And really, it is when a paradigm collapses in and of itself because of these broader sort of shifts in demography and institutional change and stocks of knowledge that you get new belief systems created. So I think if you sort of adopt an evolutionary system, some of the things that you're pointing out is fair, intermediate, maybe even intermediate long temporal challenges are actually undermining the integrity of the belief system, the institutional matrix based upon fiscal austerity, which also lay in the seeds of potential new coalitions, new structures, right? But you also see the interplay now and why you have to really be thinking about structural racism and fiscal austerity, right? Because one of the big perennial questions we ask in our class, and we can ask historically about this country, is why don't poor people of all different colors view themselves as more alike than different, right? And the answer historically is a way that race is used to create wedges between them, right? And so also the sort of notion of more intelligent thinking about race is got to be part of the discussion about how do you get these disparities now based upon income and wealth, which are increasing, to translate into different political strategies. But hard, you know. But I think here there's a way in which Detroit can be a laboratory, right? That can be trying to challenge some of those issues ahead of the curve of other parts of the country. But I'm not naive. This is not easy. No, we'll go first here, then we'll go to.
Oh, so just thank you first, but also I have a question about in the same vein, but really looking at the policy implications of it, and when you look at the policy outside of withholding revenue sharing. So the right to work state, the change in emergency management, like how it's no longer emergency financial manager, it's emergency manager now. What kind of story are we telling for other cities that are going to go through this, that have large pension crisis, that have gone, like Stockton's going to go through a second, third bankruptcy. Vallejo may go through another bankruptcy. So there are plenty of cities that are looking to Detroit as, I don't want to say a benchmark, but kind of there's policy that put us here that happened both with Snyder and with Granholm. But what are we saying beyond that? So beyond bankruptcy, beyond this policy changes and the shift in that, how do we move beyond? How do we move past that?
Yeah. No, part of it is, and it's just one of these very basic lessons that people from all disciplines teach their students. If you don't do a root cause analysis, and you have a structural problem, and you don't fix the structural problem, you've not fixed the structural problem, right? And so part of the lesson is from Vallejo and these other places, and from the Detroit public school system, is you can paper over it, you can declare victory, right? But if you don't deal with the structural components. So one of my strongest arguments for saying how do you get policymakers to take you seriously is saying, it's in your own self-interest. You can't fix this problem without going through some of these basic steps. Right? So last night, and I'm not a revolution, I'm not a radical. It's really sort of funny that I'm getting painted in this sort of notion locally, where all I said was do a root cause analysis, right? Build a plausible economic case, right? And then get public participation, right? So those are the 3 value points I was pushing, saying if you want better processes, if you want better policy, do those 3 things, right? And yet we're in a context, right, where that becomes controversial. Where this should become the norm. And what you're seeing then is sort of why and how do belief systems, and they can, and wonderfully powerful about masking their own failings, right? And that's one of the defense mechanisms. Why and how have we got to the state where we can have the three most important documents be completely ahistorical, not address issues of race, and view Detroit in isolation of the region, right? What was the political, psychological, social progression that led to this being the best and the brightest of our thinking, right? But my basic answer to them, this is sort of the answer to the judge, is it won't work, right? So forget about whether being good or bad or right or wrong normatively, it will not work descriptively, right? But how does that change the psyche is still not answering your question. That's really sort of the more important one. So, and then I have the blame excuse, right? Well, I told you they couldn't do it, and they tried to fix it once. We got to, we're not going to bail them out. They got to just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, right? The effect of that, if you think about sort of again dynamics, what we're doing is increasingly isolating the inner cities, right? Becoming increasingly abandoned. What do we do the next round? We cut more services, right? And this is what's scary if we sort of look at this in reflection of Ferguson, right? The three things that the Detroit will do as a city after bankruptcy, it will have a fire department, it will have a police department, and it will have a bulldozer department to knock down buildings, right? What happens in a city like Detroit, right, when you have an increasingly militarized police force and an increasing opportunity desert, right? That is, in the sort of worst case scenario, an escalating formula for greater repression and greater violence, right? Because it now becomes a strategic manner to be controlling the population because we're not giving them pathways to the American dream. And again, these are not, there's no easy patch, there's no easy band-aid, but those are the kind of trade-offs that we're going at, this direction or that direction. And you hope that reasonable people of all parties ultimately, will see some of these issues arise. Bob.
So I see the plan of adjustment as kind of a fiscal counterpart to Milliken v. Bradley. That Kevin Orr is trapped within a political and legal structure. That, if you started talking about participation by the metropolitan area and what have you, it would be considered ultra vires. It would be beyond his scope, and Judge Rhodes would say it's beyond my scope, to have a metropolitan plan or a statewide plan, what have you. But I see what Judge Rosen has done as at least an effort to break outside of some of those structural limitations. So bringing in foundations, for example, who probably wouldn't have been ordinarily thought as part of the mix. Bringing in at least some contribution from the state government, in large part because of his political ties and his ability to kind of shame Governor Snyder in doing some of that. But that ultimately the solution here is not a legal one in Judge Rhodes' courtroom, but must be a political one. Much as Milliken couldn't be resolved in the courts, or at least the courts decided themselves they were incapable of resolving that problem in the courts, but it would still avail itself of a political solution if there were the political will and the political effort. And I didn't think about this too much until you mentioned Ferguson. Ferguson is a city with an African-American majority, but in which most of the office holders, almost all of the office holders, are white. And there's a fairly simple reason for that. It's because the majority of the people in the city don't vote. And in November, a majority of the people in this city will not vote. And I don't see how we get a political solution if the majority of the people in the city in need of a solution don't vote.
Voting is an important but separate issue I'd go on, but I want to sort of more tack on the Milliken for a minute. First is that Milliken didn't have to come out the way it did, right? And that was really sort of the last best hope for Detroit and the region to have an alternative future that was not the one that I showed about the segregation of race and wealth. Another irony is that was really the only time when we privileged local property or local boundaries as a property right, right? When the governor announced his fiscal emergency, I was in the room, and I raised my hand and I said, well, Governor Snyder, how come you're invoking this inherent state authority to impose an emergency manager and not imposing that same authority to get regional transportation? because it's the same power, right? The same power that can let them redefine these boundaries. These boundaries don't exist if you believe the emergency manager, and it's a true statement, but the boundaries don't exist for other political purposes as well, right? And yet we'll invoke this authority to oppress one community, where we'll not invoke the same authority to create a more liberal sharing settings, right? There's sort of interesting ironies about when this power is invoked and when it's not. What we could have done, right, is focus on the water. Right? We had the mechanism within your little sort of true mapping of the geopolitics, where we could have used the Detroit Water and Sewage Department as the avenue to get regional revenue sharing that we would never get politically. Right? And so when we let loose of that asset, and I'm a big fan of regionalism, so this is sort of a little bit inconsistent, because it's saying to hold on to that asset and actually leverage that asset to force the regional revenue by renegotiating and breaking the water contracts, we actually could have gotten very far along the path of regional revenue sharing if we would have been more creative about the water. Right? So we had the avenues, right? So saying that we didn't have the options and there was the only thing possible, I would say, is not thinking enough out of the box. Although everybody understands the significance of 8 Mile, right? But that's the problem. That's not an acceptable answer to be part of a Cajun society. Voting, I think, is more complicated, right? There is an interest in psychology to say, and I've heard a couple of great discussions in the last week of African American elders trying to explain, right, to their youth about the importance of voting. And this comes in part about Judge Keith's admonishment 2 weeks ago at the 50th celebration of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission about voting being the key issue. Right? It's like everybody believes it's a political struggle, we need voting. But when you're living in a world, and I love what you were saying earlier before this started, when you deprive people to a state, and sort of economic development theory, if you're worried about physical security, you're not worried about voting. Right? If you're worried about social security, you're not worried about voting. Right? When you have so, you know, I don't know the right words, you say oppression, but just the fatigue, right? The exhaustion, right? It's very hard to get the political motivation to exercise rights, right? And we all would, in the right situation, if given the choice between water and a vote, choose water, right? But that is not the social environment, right? In which it's fair to be asking, necessarily, to everybody to be exercising the same range of rights they would if they were in the same sort of basket of opportunity. That ultimately is not an excuse, because at the end of the day, right, you have to switch hats, right? And you switch hats and you say, this is our only opportunity, right? The cavalry's not coming, nobody else is going to come and help you, right? So we have to band together with the only tools that we have, but make that message in a way that people understand, right? And then empowers them. And that's a hard sell, right? But it's, again, can be looked at in the abstract. But again, good questions and concerns people are raising.
Isn't there an issue with employment that's missing in this whole thing? If you think about the Detroit movement since 2000, people have pretty much been afraid to utilize their money. Because 2000, you had people who were afraid to use money because of the bank thing. When going from 99 to 2000, the banks might not switch to money, or you had that scare. You had 9/11, which scared people from using money, and based upon 9/11, people didn't spend money, so therefore you had the companies not making money, so Chrysler shut down, and you have plants shutting down, so now you have people who don't have jobs. Then you have them taking out loans on their houses, which caused the housing crisis because they needed money to cover whatever it was that happened before. And now we're at this point where we're at now, we don't have anything that's discussing or anything that's been said about bringing real jobs to Detroit, not $9 jobs or $10 jobs, but the jobs that were here prior to, which were $14 jobs, $13 jobs that would put people above a poverty rate of living.
Yeah. No, at one level, it's back to politics, jobs, 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 right? I would phrase it slightly different in terms of how to create opportunity. And one of the things, at least, is available to us in this kind of new order that we're finding ourselves is maybe we can find different answers to what opportunity means. Right? Because again, I think pragmatically we're going to be in a largely resource-starved area. And so looking to some of the past models may not be the most helpful way to be thinking. There's no doubt, though, that the jobs left, right? And the sort of globalization happened to Detroit first, right? So deindustrialization becomes part of the meta story that you have to be working through. And more importantly, if you have the absence of public transportation, you don't have access to a car, what you're really doing is building a wall around the city, right? And one of the most frightening statistics I recall from the Detroit Future City report is that there is one job for every 4 people that want one in Detroit. Right? There is one job for every 4 people that want one in the city. Right? That's insane. Right? That can't create opportunity. That can't create that kind of hope. That can't create the predicate for voting. And so this answer to your question becomes the most important one. How do we create opportunity for people? Right? And part of that is I was alluding to in the end, that maybe there are different models of development. Maybe there's sort of a more local focus we can be thinking. I think some of the food work is sort of imagining a world where we're looking more locally into each other. I think that notion, which I didn't say here, but I would put out on the Blight story, that if you change the capital labor ratio, right, and you move from the bulldozer, which is high capital and low labor, and say, let's say I want to get rid of blight, and I viewed that I had $1 billion, that would be the biggest jobs bill never to be voted for Detroit. But what I do is I make labor and low capital, right? And I combine that kind of job opportunity with job training. Not that sort of deconstruction is going to be the end job, but I sort of get a set of skills and a resume points and sort of put somebody on a path. Or I imagine, something we haven't even talked about, mass incarceration. I have citizen reentry, and I could sort of have these blight-related deconstruction jobs being put into a notion of returning citizens, right, and helping them out. So I'm just saying that the sort of interesting challenge from a development perspective to be saying, can we imagine new models of development? And some of the better thinking about that is not at Wayne State, but at the Boggs Center. Right? So 3 years ago, they had a Reimagining Work conference. In about 3 weeks from now, they're having to follow up, New Work, New Culture, right? Which says, at least, can we take this lemonade, or lemons, right, and think about new possibilities, but also new sources of opportunity, right? So I would love to imagine a world I would sort of bring back in the industrial jobs and the manufacturing, and I think the absence of the auto industry, who really left in the 1920s, is they got to be held accountable, right? But realistically, I'm saying we also have to be pushing the envelope on new understandings of what work may be, new opportunities that are more localized, and this notion of sustainability, in my own mind, this is still very preliminary thinking, might have some interesting possibilities of creating not just work, but opportunity and value in people's lives that better connect them to the environment, to their workplace, and to society. But your point is the most important one. No job, no opportunity, no society, right? So we don't answer that question, forget about everything else I said.
Melba had a question.
This has been great. I heard you last night, and it's so complicated, and all of the work that's gone into you analyzing sort of the total picture is just amazing. But I think that what's happening has been, you know, they've been planted, even in '68 when there was progressive things going on, there was a counter narrative that was building and other plans that were happening. What's going on, obviously, they will ultimately retrieve the city. That's what they want to do. They want to retrieve the city, and they're gonna they push people already down into the downriver area, and you're gonna begin to see, that's where the blight's gonna end up evolving over time. But in terms of the kinds of issues that you're posing, the reason that they're calling you a radical is whenever you start talking about going to the root of the cause, that's the actual definition of a radical. Not erratic. I mean, they like to refer to radicals as being erratic, but that's not the meaning of radicalism. But I think you're really on point. But also, I was really concerned about getting the word out. I don't know if you saw in the Metro Times recently, there's a very damaging analysis of the failure of the takeover of the Detroit Public Schools. A very detailed, extensive discussion of how they further screwed up the system. Rather than having answers, they just made it worse. So I think there still might be a possibility that some media outlets would be interested. It may take one-to-one specific persons who write for those journals. I would think that the Michigan Citizen would be interested in your work, for example. So I wouldn't give up on that. But I just want to thank you for your work. I think it's important, and wherever it goes, I think it's also critical, as you mentioned last night, that we document what's going on, that people understand that everybody is not falling for the okey-doke. Because sometimes it may not matter at this particular moment, but in the long run, it will matter, and it may matter for some of these other places that are gonna have to meet with that same kind of rap.
No, I love the etymology, so I point well taken.
I had a question about the bankruptcy, just like a really general one. Prior to even the arrival of the emergency manager, I think if you looked at municipal finances, they were already in a very minimalist state. I mean, extremely minimalist state.
Yeah.
In terms of transit service being minimal, but also, emergency responders being cut. And so sometimes when people talk about bankruptcy, they imply that more could be cut. And it seems hard to imagine. And so therefore, I think a more likely thing, which you're pointing at, but I'd like you to talk more about, is that it's not as much about cutting more costs, but a new notion of what a government is, I think. Maybe. I'm trying to wrap my head around what exactly is the outcome plan of the bankruptcy. If it's not to cut even more, is it more of like a different type of government with different expectations of what government should do? I was wondering if you could talk about that.
There's no doubt that it is a redefinition of the core functions of government and restriction.
Yeah.
And that's consistent with what Michelle Anderson said, this minimalist state.
Yeah.
Right? But again, think about that contrast, right? That really is separate and unequal, right? And if you say, well, what is the government doing in Oakland County, and what's the government doing in Washtenaw County? What you're going to find is completely different profiles of what's available. Right? So depending on what city you're fortunate or unfortunate to be born in depends largely, again, on sort of what trajectories you can have. There's another component, and I'm not insensitive to this either, about how if you just make better systems, you can have better efficiencies. So there's no doubt that a number of the Detroit cities, from the information system to the automation to a lot of that, could be, in theory, improved with better practices and procedures. And that then would reduce the aggregate cost of government. So it's like everything else, but that there's a legitimate core of that, right? But that also sounds like this whole sort of just, be more efficient, cut the fat, that whole sort of other genre of arguments that are often made about just making government more efficient, and then obviously privatizing all the different things that the government can't and shouldn't be doing anyway, right? The harder question, again, this is very similar to what was being asked by this gentleman, what could be a different future? Right? What could be a better future? Because ultimately I say, worldviews provide order and meaning, right? Where's the meaning in this future, right? How do we get meaning back in the sort of people's lives? How to create creative possibilities, right? And what role, I would come back to the university, what role does a university have in terms of responsibilities and in the middle of that to help answer these questions? And part of what I'm suggesting is that there really is, as you sort of view this as post-industrial, new economy, new frontier, could be interestingly new answers to that question that create different kinds of models about what society, what the economy, what the polity is. And I think that's one of the more creative potentials, right? At the end of the day, though, you got to have food, right? You got to have, in my mind, an education, right, of a way that sort of leads to some notion of fulfillment and satisfaction in life. And so some of those basic things also have to be part of that, and that requires resources. Right? So at the end of the day, as much as I like sort of imagine this sort of new society of people recreating what it means to live and work in culture, at the end of the day, as one of my colleagues likes to say about how do you fix the school system, more resources. Right? How do you get better life in Detroit? Ultimately, it's going to have a dollar sign attached to it, and we need to be a little bit more honest about that in saying that we have an obligation to each other. This goes back to this notion. If I go back to this notion of a beloved community as my belief system, I don't call it a bailout. Right? I have a whole notion of what obligations I have to provide assistance and opportunity and caring and nurturing for other people. And there's a whole lot of healing that needs to take place, right? This sort of 80 years, 100 years of structural racism has created all sorts of trauma. You look at some of the psychology studies, the sort of mental health studies, the difficulties are being created. So part of those resources really have to be devoted towards healing of people who have suffered tremendous amounts of trauma in the environments in which they've been living in. To let them make the kind of choices for themselves about what kind of future they would create. And that's why I sort of say if you draw the circle only around Detroit, you've basically said we've become Donner Pass, right? And then we all look at each other with hungry eyes. And that's not the right answer. And while resources are scarce, we have a broader sort of national problem about what commitments we can make. At the end of the day, it has to be a self-conscious lobbying to say, and not from foundations, right? That's not the privatized answer. The answer is what we as a society owe each other. right? And what resources we need to be generating as a society that provides opportunity for each other. And I think there could be new mold to that, right? I'm sort of excited about some part of that, but there's an old school answer as well.
Teaching public policy for 30 years. I agree with 90% of what you said, but you can't really paper over the lengthy legacy of government failures in the city of Detroit. That's the narrative that'll be purchased up in Oakland County. You have a $90 million paperclip downtown. How did that happen? You have a bunch of clueless people in Wayne County that aren't paying attention to what's going on. Then you have, the city was fairly well run by Coleman Young. You can go through the history. Kilpatrick comes along, and that's what everybody's talking about now. The city's bleeding middle-class residents. It's unaffordable. State policy. We have Cadillac auto insurance. Middle-class people can't afford to pay auto insurance and live in the city. We have 68 mills. Whatever you tax, you get less of. No wonder housing is being abandoned and destroyed. I advise somebody that did not pay his tax bills. He abandoned his house, was trashed 3 days later, scavenged. What else do we have going on in the city? 2 generations of failure in the public schools. And you say the neoclassical argument doesn't work. I agree, charter schools, that's what adults care about, but that's not what leads to learning in the classroom. Nobody pays attention to Ken Myers' studies down in Texas. It's real basic, 4 or 5 things. Stable administrators, capable administrators, homework, parental involvement, stable curriculum, experienced teachers. None of that is the narrative of charter schools, private schools. So, I think you've made a very good argument tonight. It's a narrative that's a problem.
Yeah. And the narrative has defense mechanisms. So as you said, the sort of narrative bias is they look at Detroit, they look at the corrupt mayor, and that becomes their prepaid explanation for it. And there are issues we need to address as a society.
Well, I guess how do you change the discourse?
It comes back first with a better understanding of structural racism, a willingness to raise issues of race in my mind. I think somebody made a strategic choice that not talking about race was somehow smart, right? And that would let us have different discussions and other stuff. I just disagree with that. I think you have to be creative about how you have the conversations, right? I think for some people, a meditation on white privilege lets them grow in ways that they wouldn't grow if sort of a more addressing race would happen. But I go back to my 3 R's. You have to look at things from the role of race, regionalism, and reconciliation, and you got to put true names on things, right? And maybe I'm wrong about that, but you've got to sometimes just call people out on the carpet, right? And challenge the narrative that you're getting. And you got to have other strategies. You're trying to be more creative as you're trying to get some kind of internal change that's taking place within them that enable them to see different possibilities. But it's tough, so I'm not going to deny that. Incredibly tough, and maybe the answer is that there is no answer, right? So the most logical notion is we're in a downward spiral, and maybe that downward spiral can't be stopped.
I mean, are there win-win options? So, you can get L. Brooks Patterson to agree to COBO, lead people by the nose and show them why it's in their self-interest to do X, Y, and Z.
I wish, but they haven't seen that self-interest in 40 years for L. Brooks. You know? And I'd like to remind people, I'll make this the last point, L. Brooks got his political start responding to a Judge Keith opinion. Judge Keith ruled in the opinion to desegregate the Pontiac busing, and L. Brooks demagogued that all the way to his current position, right? And if that's your starting point, you sort of get a sense of what's inside, right? And nothing's changed since then in my observation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.